And when I see the blinking light, it will be go time. Okay, I believe we are recording. Hey, everybody, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We are now officially into the 2021 1455 author series with our second event, many more to come. And if this is your first time joining one of our events, welcome. Thank you for checking us out. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455. And what we are briefly is a nonprofit arts organization. And our mission is simple. We want to constantly be celebrating creativity and building community by any means necessary. And some of the ways we do that is through a robust free events and programming schedule, including events like this, as well as our 1455 interview series. We have a bi-monthly digital magazine called Movable Type. And of course, we have our annual summer festival, which is a free event that is becoming global and attracts readers and writers from all over the world. I encourage anyone that's interested in finding out more and supporting us to check us out at www.1455litarts.org. Tonight, I continue to be delighted to be in partnership with our friends at DC's historic The Potter's House. I'm joined, as usual, by my pal, Talia Jaffe. She's here to say a few words. Talia, take your time and explain the great work you folks are doing there day in and day out at the Potter's House.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I'm Talia Jaffe, the Events and Operations Manager here at the Potter's House. We are delighted to have you all here and to welcome Jeannine here tonight. As always, we're so grateful for our partnership with 1455 Literary Arts under Sean's skillful leadership. For those of you that don't already know the Potter's House well, welcome. For those of you that do know, a quick plug to share that the Potter's House is a nonprofit social enterprise, a bookstore, cafe, and event space serving up radical hospitality in Adams Morgan since 1960. We're currently open for takeout and book browsing from 8:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. daily, and during these hours, we offer a warm meal and cup of coffee to anyone who needs, no questions asked. If you or someone you know are in need of daily meals, please send them our way. We're especially thrilled to have Jeannine here with us this evening because her heartbreaking and strikingly beautiful memoir is simply stunning. It's a brilliant expression of the understanding that we carry our brokenness, our traumas with us every single day, but we are still, in fact, whole. An understanding that we try to embody with everyone that comes through the Potter's House doors every single day. I'm so excited for you to experience this story with us tonight. You can purchase your copy of The Part That Burns from our bookshop.org storefront. I'll drop the link in the comments shortly. Again, thank you all for joining us, and to Jeannine and Sean, thank you in advance for what I know will be an incredibly meaningful dialogue.
Talia, thank you so much. And as I say, it's always better to do these types of events in collaboration. So we at 1455 endorse and support and love your mission. So this is a joy and a pleasure for us. So it's very appropriate tonight that Jeannine is joining us as most of our country is ensconced in a winter wonderland. I'm talking to somebody from Minnesota, so we were joking before we came on live that this is just another February day for her. But I do want to send out some genuine empathy to our brothers and sisters who are struggling right now. We hope that help is on the way and that everyone is safe and healthy as possible. And for those of you joining us from around the country, be well and be safe. And we hope that we can have a good time tonight focusing on some artistic stuff. So without further ado, let me introduce our special guest, Jeannine Ouellette. Her essays and stories have appeared widely, including in North American Review, Narrative, Penn Review, Proximity, and more. She is a former fellow of the Millay Colony for the Arts and Brush Creek Foundation for the Arts, and her work has been published in several anthologies, including Ms. Aligned, Women Writing About Men and Women's Lives, Multicultural Perspectives, as well as being recognized in many contests. She teaches writing through the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop and the University of Minnesota. She lives with her family in Minneapolis, near the banks of the Mississippi, where she's working on her first novel. Her memoir, The Part That Burns, has been described by none other than Joyce Carol Oates as, quote, simply beautiful, precisely imagined, poetically structured, compelling, and vivid. I agree. Jeannine, it's a delight to have you here. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's super exciting to be here, and it's an honor.
Well, it's the honor and pleasure is ours. And let me hold up, as always, it is much more meaningful to do these types of events when you can genuinely look into the camera and say, I loved this book. This is no exception. So I'm giddy to have a chance to talk to the author of a book that really moved me and that I can't recommend highly enough. In fact, my opening salvo would be, I think typically we veer into cliche, but the typical approbation is, this book was so great, I just absorbed it in one sitting. And for me personally, I recognized pretty early on that this was going to necessarily be a slower go because it was so intense and so wonderfully devastating and beautiful. I really needed to slow down and absorb it and let the language and the emotions wash over me. So not saying that would be anyone else's experience, but I really savored this on a line by line level. And like I said, I'm delighted to talk to you about how you pulled together a narrative that deals with some pretty heavy stuff, but also weaved it together with poetic imagery and a lot of winning images and metaphors, which we'll get into. I think the best way to start really is, memoir and truth. You talk about this explicitly in the book. The notion of truth, it's slippery. And when someone's writing a memoir that involves other characters, inevitably, that's always going to present challenges. So right from the start, maybe talk us through, to me, it's very obvious why this had to be a memoir as opposed to a novel, but how did you approach this material and when did you know this is going to be a memoir and I'm going to have to tell my truth no matter, the landmines that involves in terms of someone's life?
Mm. That's a great question and a really complicated question. And, this manuscript at one time was a novel. I did novelize it, and some of the bits that were previously published were published as fiction. So yeah, I think I really struggled with that. And I think at the root of that was the challenge that you're talking about. That could I come out with this, the whole of it, and as truth, and be exposed in that way. And so not just for not just for the all of the lives, but also my own. It was really tricky and a bit scary.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm giving anything away to say. In fact, I think it's a necessary teaser for those that are curiosities piqued. That this memoir deals with trauma, childhood pain, and yet I want to say that while it does it unflinchingly, there's an extraordinary generosity in this book. I think, and I don't invoke the cliche truth lightly. There's a real desire to grapple with your truth, the truth of the events, but also the notion of looking at events as they happen from the perspective of an older and wiser person that is carrying that damage. So I want to acknowledge that, there's a real attempt to do what I think all great art does, which is to get at the truth, understanding that everyone's truth is different. Maybe one way we can attack that from 100,000-foot view is to talk about the title and what that signifies, both to you and in the context of the narrative. What is The Part That Burns?
Well, it was, actually, I'm going to read from that title chapter tonight.
Right.
And it was an image that came to me when I was writing about my son's birth. And this idea of I am, the part that burns. There's a lot going on for the narrator in that chapter. And in that scene, when she's in the intensity of the birth experience, what I tried to do, because this is what how in reflecting, this is what I really think happened. There was an integration in that moment. And so that idea that she was, intensely in her body, but also outside of her body, sort of observing this integrating experience, wherein she was both the part that burns, but also that the part that burnt was the part that glowed. So there was this, there was that was a sense of wholeness. I always talk about how we have these traits, like I consider myself kind of brave, but that can also have, the underside, it can be impulsive, or I can take certain, maybe unwise risks. And I think every single human quality has that. And I think that's kind of, I think that's part of what the title is getting at, that our experiences are like that too.
For sure. And, let's face it, a great book does need a good title. I think this does that service. I think you just articulated that beautifully. I would say it works so well on so many levels, because we could be talking about what memory does, what trauma does, and why we're compelled to tell our stories. It is that part that burns, the burning of curiosity, the burning of pain and memory. So yeah, just a beautiful, evocative title that the reader will see the richness. And I'm really glad you're going to read from that section in particular. We had talked a little bit before this event about some of the topics that we wanted to tackle, because frankly, this memoir, goes deep and goes long. We could and should talk for hours about, womanhood and motherhood and daughterhood and the construction of narrative. But you had said something I really liked. I'm just going to quote it. Maybe you can riff on it. The notion of how writers can or do write our way out of painful experiences, and the art and science of that, the how and why of it. From maybe like a technical as well as emotional perspective, how did you grapple with such complex, complicated material and weave it into not only a narrative whole, but a narrative that is not easily, this is a reader's and a writer's type of book, in my opinion, which is a high compliment. This is not light reading, but again, I mean that in a very positive way. But how did you grapple with this notion of writing your way out of memories and pain?
Well, I don't know. Do you know the researcher James Pennebaker? He does research on linguistics and psychology out of the University of Texas at Austin. And he's done a lot of research on expressive writing to heal, which it's more complicated than it sounds. And so one of the things that his research shows is that when you write in a very specific way, when you approach expressive writing in a very specific way, and the way he describes that is it's finite, it's timed, and you only do it for a specific, like he recommends 4 days for 15 or 20 minutes. And he also specifically recommends, so this is like for everyone, not just for writers. He also recommends that people, after for day 1, day 2, day 3, that you're starting to look at the story from different perspectives, maybe use a little dialogue, see different angles on it. And from his point of view, from the research that he's done, that's where the release happens. That's where the healing happens in expressive writing. And he even goes on to say that, to be a little bit cautious about journaling, because journaling, when we kind of write this same, which everyone who journals knows, you can kind of like just say the same thing over and over again, and that can concretize a trauma.
Oh, wow.
Instead of releasing it, kind of cut that groove deeper and deeper. And so for me, as a writer and a teacher of writing, one of the things that I have come to believe pretty strongly is that it's the craft. So this is like taking Pennebaker's work, to the next level in terms of from a writer's perspective, that it's through that crafting of the narrative. It's through really wrestling with, all of those challenges and problems that we face. Like how do I structure this? And what, both on the big picture level and on the line level, how can I take this thing? And for me, one of the things that was really important is I wanted it to be beautiful. So how do you take something, how do you take hard things and tell them in a way that's truthful, but maybe that can still have beauty in it? And so, so I think that when you're writing your way out of something, I think that's where that happens. And just really briefly, I remember a day specifically when I was working on one of the pieces in the book is called Tumbleweeds, one of the chapters. And I was working really hard on it, and I was like really deep in it. And I'd given myself all of these constraints to work with in the writing of that. So it was, it was kind of fun. It was like a puzzle, like, okay, how do I work in the Western meadowlark, or like the, mating and breeding habits of the Western meadowlark, and just working with, or the inauguration speech of Jimmy Carter, how do I do this? And I remember, it was like I saw something happening and I was excited about it and I thought it was working. And but there's a lot of intense things in that piece. And I remember saying to my husband, I'm really having fun writing this. Like I'm having fun. And then catching myself and thinking that's so strange and incongruous. Like this, there should not be fun in this. And yet at the same time, there almost has to be a levity or a lightness in order to bring that to the page. It has to be also in the process too.
For sure. And I think you just nailed really kind of the yin yang of memoir writing, which is, I think, so often we focus on, and critics focus on, this notion of truth, which is important. But I think what gets forgotten is it's art and it's craft. So for even if it's the most the most truthful attempt to recreate things that are important, there has to be meaning for the reader and there has to be joy for the reader. So I strongly believe that no writer has the right to ask any reader to stay engaged with their work. If the writer is clearly not having fun, how can you expect the reader to have fun? And I'm glad you mentioned the humor too, because I would have done you a disservice if I didn't mention, in addition to the beauty and the line by line poetry and imagery, there's brilliant use of levity, which is of course necessary, but
Mhm.
also is critical to pointing out, a full life. That's how we live our lives. I also think what you kind of are alluding to, or getting at, is something that's come up both in this series and things I've read and heard authors say, which is that, and I believe that, trauma or writing about trauma requires time, because when it's still so fresh, the author doesn't have perspective on it. So even if they're writing their truth, it might not resonate. Where when you have the distance, you can start to put together craft and a way that narrative can be weaved out so that it's entertaining as opposed to therapy on the page.
Yes, exactly. That was really true for me. It took me a very long time. I'm 52, so the events in this book, start, at the age of 4 or so, and the bulk of the book takes place between about the age of 4 and 30 or so. So that's a long time,
Right.
and and it took a long time. It wasn't that I hadn't tried, you know, sooner. But
Right.
it wasn't, I was never satisfied. I could see that, ooh, this isn't working. Um, yeah, and Mary Oliver has a line about, in one of her poems, a line about someone once gave me, I might not be getting this quite right, but a box of darkness, and that something about coming to realize that that too was a gift. And sometimes I think about that line because in our work as writers, it's our work to find the gift in it and then figure out how to render that on the page. You can't just hand a reader a box of darkness,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, and I think, on an artistic level, and much less a human level, I suffice it to say, the book you might have written at 30 or 35 or 45 would be different, and I do think it would have lacked elements of the humor and the beauty, and importantly the generosity that you bring to bear here. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, which is one of my takeaways. One of the things I really admire about this book is that, again, you're trying to tell not just your truth, which is such a, and there's nothing wrong with 21st century mantras, but you are telling your truth, but you're really struggling to tell the truth and be fair to the many characters that have been in your life, and trying to explore why they did what they did, or what their constraints were that made them act the way they were. And that gives the narrative a certain richness, I think. There's a line in the book, a wonderful passage that I want to quote to you, and then we're going to get you to read from it. But I'll quote you. Here's the thing about doorways: once you step through them, you can't go back. Even if you do, you'll never see the world the same as before. That's almost like a beautiful Zen. It's very simple, but it's very profound. I think that, as well as any line I could read, would really encapsulate kind of the leitmotif of what you're doing here. Talk to us a little bit about the doorway and how you interpret that, both as a writer and, the star, for lack of a better word, of this narrative.
You know, that it comes from a true factual childhood preoccupation, of searching for doorways. That's in the book. And what's not in the book is that I had a friend, the friend is in the book, Nora, she's in the chapter about Jimmy Carter, but we used to go up to Casper Mountain. Her parents were building a cabin, and, literally go out into the mountainside and search for these places where tree branches formed an arch overhead, and imagine, this as a portal that we could step through, and we would be in some kind of, alternate reality. And I was very, very, very taken with that idea. So it started, I think, in the book with really wanting to capture that, because it was more than a desire to escape, which I'm sure that was also partly that. But I think it was a sense of just kind of grasping at an understanding of transformation, and the possibility of, that thin line between one thing and another. And so I think, as I saw that emerging in the narrative, I wanted to carry that forward in the narrator's life, because I felt like, again, I felt like that was true. I felt like there were so many ways in which that was a part of what her quest was. And there's a point at which she says something about becoming a mother and having children, and this too could be a doorway. So this idea of seeing these, moments or possibilities in life as a way to pass from oneself to the other.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that the notion of, well, another thing we tend to talk about with memoir, is how, writing saves writers. And I certainly can relate to that and believe it. But I think more going even deeper is the notion of imagination. It's imagination that leads to the writing. And the part that burns really kind of interrogates the cultivation of imagination and how that leads to empathy, and how, as a writer, that along with curiosity are kind of the divine triangle that I think creates art. This notion of, you have to be curious, you have to have an imagination, or else you're just not gonna, things happen and you react and you move along. But your book really takes pains to talk through these formative events, and how kind of the sensibility of a writer emerged from this trauma, and joy and humor, and banality, right? It's got all of that, which I hope is an adequate tee up for a reading. I'd love you to read as promised, and let us hear the author's voice.
Okay. Yes. Let's move on to that. I just wanted to say that also, before I read, I wanted to thank you. I'm really pleased that you're noting a generosity in the book. That was so important to me, and I also had to work for it. Every revision, like you have your checklist of what you're revising for, and I felt like every revision, that was kind of like top of the list, just to go a little deeper with, like, what more, like you said, how much more curiosity can I bring to this, or how much more empathy, or how much more clarity can I bring to, to the other characters, and, what they also were carrying. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. My pleasure to note what I felt.
So this, like I said, this is the opening of the title chapter, which is called The Part That Burns. The woman next to me is moaning, a low, wet gurgle from under her ribs. I shouldn't hate her for this, but I do. I could whip out a gun right now, the moaner says during her turn to speak. She looks at me, points her finger. I could shoot you. She moves her finger gun slowly around the circle, pointing at each of us. I could shoot all of you. Bang, bang, bang. I look away. I don't believe this woman has a gun. I don't believe she will shoot me or anyone. Still, I root myself into my chair, resist the urge to smooth the denim of my maternity dress where it has wrinkled on my lap, where I've been gripping it in my damp hands, twisting. It's a cold March, and I am 5 months pregnant with my second child. Third, if you count. But here's the thing. I was 18 at the time, fresh out of foster care, and the father was a car thief, also a gun runner. Not that I knew about the cars or the guns until years later when I Googled him and saw his mugshot. He was in federal prison by then. Anyway, I'm pregnant with my second child. The woman's breathing loudly through her mouth, this woman beside me. I try not to spin my wedding ring around. I've been married to John for almost 3 years. Our daughter Sophie will be 2 in August. I was 21 when John and I married. He was 25 and already had his teaching degree by then. Also his own car. Check, check. Stable family too. His parents were still married and not wealthy, but middle class, I guess. No criminal record. Check, check, and check again. John also had a fiancée whose name was the same as mine, except spelled differently. Uncheck, I guess, and question mark. Things mean things, but it's hard to know exactly what. My wedding ring is a yellow gold band, the kind that overlaps in front so that the small diamond, the same diamond John took back from the first Jeannine when I said I couldn't see him if he was engaged, more or less floats between the 2 ends of the band, which don't actually meet to form a circle, but instead go off in their own directions. Modern. John had gotten my ring custom made downtown at the same place where he had purchased the original ring. The jeweler melted the gold from the first Jannine's band, made it into mine, and reset the diamond. I stare at the ring now to stop myself from moving my hands or any other part of my body. Speaking of my body, it is heavy in this folding chair, even though I myself am not heavy. I am weightless, like fire, floating up near the ceiling, which is brown with water stains. A body is made up of parts, bones, fascia, tendons, muscle, nerves, viscera, skin. Parts are made up of cells. My cells are vibrating. I hold my breath to stop the vibrations. The baby inside me kicks, and I slam back down into the folding chair. In the corner of this dim room, a space heater rattles. Our group leader is speaking now to the moaning woman with the gun finger. Our leader is saying over and over, shh, it's okay. We're all going to be okay. But the moaner just keeps moaning, making more of those gurgling sounds, wetter than before. I try not to look, but I do. Tears stream down her cheeks and drip onto her red t-shirt, spreading into inky dark splotches. Now the older woman across from me is speaking because it is rightfully her turn. She says, my father, it was almost every night those years, and my sister, I couldn't keep him off her, and I'd have taken him twice. I would have if, now she blows the stream of air through her thin lips. My sister killed herself last year. Another woman, the thin one with hands so chapped they bleed, says nothing at her turn. She just stares down into whatever she sees in the frayed fibers of the gray commercial carpet. We meet in the basement of Trinity Lutheran, our support group for adult survivors of incest and childhood sexual abuse. On the cusp of 24, I am the youngest person in the room by far. My therapist told me I should attend these meetings. As for her, well, I found her in the Center City Yellow Pages under counseling when I couldn't stop the thoughts of mafia. Not since that night I was pulling Sophie, like I said, almost 2 already, and suddenly so much easier to see as the child she will soon be at 3, at 4, pulling her from the sudsy water of our old clawfoot tub, grasping her tightly under her arms, all silky slipperiness, and realizing how perfect she is, and therefore how perfect I must have been at her age too. As I held Sophie's squirmy body, that was when Mafia started coming at me again, the way he did back in the rocky city of Duluth, in the greenhouse on the hill above Lake Superior. And after that, Wyoming, where we moved for Mafia's Exxon job. First to Douglas, then to Casper, and when it all fell apart, back to Minnesota again. But Wyoming, It's the mafia of Wyoming I remember most vividly. Mafia of the high wind and sharp tumbleweeds, the mountain and the shadow of the mountain where he left his mark. Mafia came back that night as I held Sophie close to me, and now he's hunkered down to stay, all settled into my body with his basement bed and oily jean jacket. I can't stand it. So here I sit on a metal folding chair in the lower level of Trinity Lutheran, hating this woman with her tear-splotched t-shirt, her threats and her moans, her stupid finger gun, hating her for being exactly like me, ruined, but letting it show.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's an ideal. You couldn't have picked a wrong passage, but that gets at it. And really, we can continue to talk about craft, but I'd also love to really acknowledge, especially as a man, I think this is a very important book. Well, I mean, it's an important book for women to read for so many obvious and beautiful reasons. But boy, I think a lot of men can and should read this book to get a better, especially those that have not yet been fathers, to get a real sense of womanhood, motherhood, and even in the best circumstances, the trauma that does to bodies, the trauma that does worrying about a baby's body, and just the ceaseless concern that goes into bringing a life into the world. And yet another thing I think that you really just nail succinctly, you return to it, but you don't linger on it. But this notion of someone that's experienced trauma, and you referenced the mafia character, the almost guilt, the perverse and so painful to read guilt of someone that's gone through trauma, feeling this burden to protect their not yet born child, and how horrible it is to have that kind of trauma resurface when it should be a time for joy and a time for, peace. I don't even know where to dive in other than to say I want to also celebrate that this memoir does a wonderful job of interrogating motherhood, and you of course attack it from the angle of a daughter, a sister, a mother. Talk a little bit about just how you grappled with. I mean, it's obviously it's a deep subject that couldn't be more meaningful, but in the for the memoir you couldn't go too deep, but you lay it all out there. So I don't know if that's a question or not, but well, you know what, I'll tee it up this way, because I quoted another line that I love, so may I'll help you out. Thinking about your mother's shortcomings, and the generosity with which you do so. At one point you write, quote, "I have a sea of rage in me and a baby. I can reconcile neither." This memoir details your struggle to do exactly that.
Oh, that's thank you. I appreciate that. This whole chapter I think is devoted to that, that really painful grappling that the narrator went through, which wasn't quite as articulated with the first child. Although just when you talked about like that guilt and that drive to protect, you brought back a memory for me that when I was pregnant with my daughter, my first daughter, so I was 21, and I remember that when I would be driving the car, and like when you're stuck in traffic and there's exhaust, coming up, and I would feel like, oh, I can't breathe this in, this will be bad for the baby. So then I would hold my breath, and then I would think, oh, I can't hold my breath because that would be bad for the baby. And I feel like that's such a perfect example of, there's a bit of, it's a, yeah, I don't want to use the word futility, but the idea, there's a mythology, I guess, that you can, and this is something that's very interesting to me because I was very very driven by that mythology, but that you can do everything right, and somehow that if you can do everything right, that there could never come any harm, to the child. And you can imagine why this narrator would be driven, by that. I think it's no surprise, and it totally makes sense. But that's crazy making. Like you can barely get through a day living in the world.
Right, right. Well, and I think one of the human triumph of this novel, and I'm probably gonna make you blush, but again, coming from a very genuine place, we literature, not to mention nonfiction, deals so much with the notion of the cycle of abuse, the cycle of futility, the cycle of dysfunction. I think one of the gifts of both this novel and your life is this idea of how do I do better than those, than was done to me. The notion of forgiveness and the notion of how do I take this trauma and do my best to ensure that I can't control what may or may not happen, but I can at least control my love and the attempt I make to bring beautiful babies into the world and support them. That really comes throughout the narrative. And I think above all the other things we've talked about, which hopefully those of you that haven't read this yet, are you getting why this is a deep, beautiful book? But I think that's the ultimate triumph of the story. And you don't call attention to it, but it emerges that this has been part of your life's work and it is a cliche, but it's very applicable. You transcend your own experience to take your life to a different, better place. In fact, I'll quote you again. You talk about, in fact, I probably know it. I want to read it. You talk about an argument you're having with your then husband, and kind of comparing the notion of the dysfunction and what did you learn from your parents? He asks as a dig, and let me see if I can find it, just because I want to be respectful to the brilliance of the writing. It's intended as a deep dig, like, what did you learn from your parents? And you say, my parents did teach me things. First and foremost, maybe forever, they taught me to want more. I think that also nails this idea of what, taking, it's a very human lesson. Are we going to take the easy way out? Which is the stupid way to put it up. But the easier, the path of least resistance, and say, the world kicked me first. So to really say, no, we can do better. I can do better. And yeah, that's life's work.
Yeah, and as we were talking about earlier in the evening, the idea of everything kind of having two sides, the yin and the yang of everything. And I think one of the things I've been aware of in my life is that when so obviously there was a lot of trauma in my upbringing, and so when I came into adulthood, I did not have this sense of like that I knew how to do anything. I couldn't just kind of be on autopilot or coast along thinking, oh, I know how to do this, I'll just do what I know, because I knew that what I knew I couldn't do. So it was, when you talk about curiosity, I became, very avidly curious about what I believed and how I wanted to, or how I might be able to act on those beliefs. And so I think sometimes that was a real gift, because I didn't, nothing was unexamined, and so I can see the gift in that I mean, and like everything, like from, which also can be exhausting, but everything from, beliefs and values, and like, what you want to eat or how you want to cook, or, so like the mundane things all the way to the profound things.
Yeah. And again, I think this there's a valuable service in this book, although this is definitely disconcerting. But I think we all endorse literature and journalism and reporting that exposes the fact that these traumas, although of course very unique in nature and to the individual, the circumstances, the horrifying normalcy of these horrific acts of predation, and how most people, for a variety of reasons, choose to be quiet for survival, for security, to protect loved ones. I think it's a very brave act to look unflinchingly at how one was treated, and try to make sense of it, but also I don't want to put words in your narrative's mouth, but to try to grapple with understanding. Although I want to say, as a man especially, it's uniquely horrible, and enough said. But that you're not the only person this happened to, and how do we make it less painful and awkward to talk about? Because the only thing worse than these traumas are the people that feel they can't talk about them. Because I can't imagine how horrible, and speaking of a part that never stops burning, someone that is not able to find a community or a way that to talk through, what was done and bury it.
Well, I think I'm glad you brought that up because you talked about you've mentioned a couple of times the speaking out in this way of that we have our loved ones and there's various people involved or close to a situation that you have a concern, or a fear of speaking out. There's always that fear of hurting the other. And I think, though, that it's really important to talk about the harm that comes to women, or any other, people who experience this kind of predation, as you put it. I think that was a really great way to put it. That it's not without risk of harm for the person who's experienced the trauma to speak. And an example of that, in the book, is when the narrator is in 8th grade and first starting to understand, the significance of what her stepfather did to her, and makes the decision to talk to her mother about it. And then news travels back to her father, and via her father, her stepmother, who then treats her like a predator. And that was profoundly destructive. In some ways, for me, like, that's the most destructive moment in the book, and the impact of that. And so then you have a person, who, carries that, that feeling of, like, if people know this about me, then I'm the one who's going to be judged. So I think, and I don't think, and I mean, we know what happens when women come forward with reporting rapes.
Yeah.
It's just across the board. It's the same story over and over again. Is that there's a real reason people don't talk about these things, because there is a cost. So yeah, so when the book was first coming out, I had published some of these pieces previously and survived it, so I thought, like, okay, I can do this. And I underestimated how it would feel to have the book coming out in the world, and to have people who didn't know these things about me, but who were close to me, who maybe didn't read my literary work, but now we're going to know about this book. um, and I told my husband, like, all of a sudden I realized, like, his family was going to be reading this book, and they were talking on Facebook about ordering it. And I'm like, you have to email your sister. Like, you need to warn her, and you need to just, like, I don't know, like, you have to say, like, be kind, take this in a light of, um, compassion, because I felt like all of that same old trepidation totally rising back up. Like, oh my God, I can't have people knowing these things about me, which I, really thought was put to rest, which is so much really right what the book is all about. Like, just when you think you've put something to rest, there it is again. Like in the passage that I read, oh, wow, there's Mafia again. What are you doing here? You're not welcome here. But there he was.
Yeah, and in fact, so two things. So first of all, I think you deal with the heartbreaking, reality that, and it happens to men too, but primarily for women, victimized once, but then re-victimized by
Mhm.
being looked at as tainted, or because the individuals don't want to deal with reality, would prefer not to, so it's easier to make them black sheep. And so there's this ongoing trauma that can't be healed because of the weakness of others. So that's awful. But you also talk, and I wanted to talk about, because I think I think it was probably inevitable for you through the craft of this, but the notion of you deliberately use kind of non-linear narrative. And my take on that is that memory doesn't function in a linear fashion. So why would a memoir function? So of course, in my humble opinion, the narrative is stronger for that, although it may be slightly, I don't think it is, but it's might be slightly tougher going for a more literal minded reader. But talk a little bit about, was that always inevitable, or did you come to realize, like, I have to circle back on certain themes, and I think frankly, it would be easier for the writer to, maybe for the reader, but for the writer to just say, here's what happened, A to B, A to Z. Life isn't that easy, so a book shouldn't be that easy.
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that I do think it's a more challenging structure. I happen to really love fragmented work, so I'm on board for it. But I know that that's not necessarily true. I teach, like some books I love: Justin Torres' We the Animals, Abigail Thomas' Safekeeping, Carmen Maria Machado in The Dream House. Like, I could go on about like just such beautiful fragmented work that I love, but one must acknowledge that every experimental element that you introduce to, a piece of writing is tasking the reader with something. So when I teach writing, I always, so you can do it, but just consider, is it necessary? Does it serve the narrative? Why? Because you're asking more of the reader. There was a wonderful piece in Writer's Chronicle in their fall issue, so a couple of issues back, by a writer named Jennifer Senor. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, called Brief But True. And it was about Flash, but she talked about chronological structures. She said human beings are so chronological, we are so time bound, that if you put us in a dark room anywhere in the world, that within like a couple of days, a very short period of time, we would wake and sleep at the time of the sunrise and sunset on the equator, which I just think is fascinating. I think that's so wild. And so she goes on to talk about like chronological storytelling is the way we're wired. It's the way that you and I would talk to each other if we were, out having, a drink or something. And it's very comforting and it makes sense to us. And then she said, and I think this is brilliant, it's the macaroni and cheese of narrative structure because it's so comforting and familiar. So anyway, so I think whenever you veer from that, it's a choice to be really aware of. But I tried a slightly more chronological structure. I took so I've mentioned a couple of times, some of these pieces were written and published in different forms before the book. And so when I realized I had a book emerging, a book is kind of starting to try to grow. I first took those pieces apart, and you can imagine this knowing the book. And I made index cards, and I took out all of the vignettes from the existing pieces, and I put those in a certain, mostly chronological order. And then I wrote some connective, tissue, things that I felt like were missing, etc. And it didn't really work the same way. And what I started to realize was that the way that I wrote the pieces was reflective of the way that, the way that they spoke to each other, the way they overlapped but were different, was really similar to the experience of the way that memory, and particularly with regard to trauma, but even just in general, is like that. Like, how every time you remember an event, you're not actually remembering the event, you're remembering your last memory of the event. And so we're constantly revising our memories. It's inevitable, it's literally impossible. And so I felt like the way that the pieces revisited certain things, but as you said, either from a different perspective or from a different point in time, and I think one of the places in the book where that's really important is when the narrator is, it's after the second child, her son is born, and she's starting to go through some difficult times in her marriage as she's trying to deal with all of this, and her spouse doesn't really understand what's going on, because this isn't really, she didn't have these, struggles when they got married. Like, where's this all coming from? And she's remembering a time after the birth of the first child, on their anniversary. She's remembering their first sexual experience and just having a completely different understanding of that than she did, at the time. And I think, so I think that is a place in the book where what the whole book is doing is sort of crystallized, in a really direct way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a series of transitions and transformations that, as the reader is discovering them, I'm sure they were true to life as you were experiencing them yourself as you went through them. Things that you wouldn't have necessarily anticipated, which again is a life lesson, right? We don't know, no matter what we intend, that our personal narrative is not going to necessarily follow our best intentions, and things like becoming a parent or having trauma or any number of things can complicate relationships and kind of the trajectory that we were on. I wanted to celebrate you at least one last time for a scene. I just want to in real time acknowledge it, because I think this is everything that good art does. It's devastating, it's hilarious, it's everything. But there's when you transition from talking so much about being a daughter, I think it's as or more powerful when you talk about being a mother. But you talk about your oldest daughter goes through her biting stage, and there's one scene where Sophie, you have tried to calmly, effectively convey the boundaries, and at one point you talk about your daughter holding her doll, and as children do, saying no biting to the doll, and then in a conspiratorial whisper, I bite mama. I mean, to me, that's great writing. It's really a scene that makes me want to laugh and cry at the same time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
I mean, how, and of course you actually give your daughter some space, which I think is a very risky gambit that pays off. Maybe talk a little bit about, your perspective as a mother that is a writer, and how that in and of itself, your desire to find the truth is making sure that other voices are heard and other perspectives are spoken for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know exactly what the question is, but you're making me think about
Sorry.
you're making me think about last piece in the book, which I actually co-wrote with it's the second to last piece, but with
Yes.
my youngest
Sorry,
daughter.
that's what I was alluding to. Like when I say you literally give voice to.
Oh, okay.
No.
So I was hearing you correctly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what's funny is that we wrote that piece together in, how like when you're on social media and Facebook in particular, like it gives you your memories. And so this week I'm getting like things I was saying. There's a little picture of a Post-it note that Lily wrote to me saying, Mama, I know what we need to write about, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So Lily had come to me with that idea, and the piece, from reading it, that Lily is an early childhood development major. So that's what Lily does with their life work. They currently work at a crisis nursery for children here in Minneapolis. So that was, they were in their last semester of college at that point, really immersed in the final study of all of these, concepts, and said, this was such an exciting idea. I want to look at this this connection, how is it that my childhood and my upbringing, this is my daughter speaking, was so different from yours, and yet, there's these resonances and synergies, and what is that, and how much is in what is cellular memory, and what's passed along. And so that was just an amazing experience to write that way with Lily. And what we did, and I think when you read the piece, it's really obvious, although it might not be something that you're thinking about, because when you're reading, you're just in the experience. But the rule that we set, the convention, was that I would write only about Lily's story. So in other words, I told Lily's story, Lily told mine, and then it went back and forth that way, which was just an extraordinary way to hear about myself, and vice versa. But there's one piece in that essay where Lily, the character, the narrator, Lily as the narrator, is talking about learning things about her mother, and says, that was the moment and that was it. That was the moment I realized my mama's full humanity, the completeness of her humanity, I think is the line, and when we were writing that, we would write every morning and set a timer, and then we'd kind of read out loud to each other what we wrote. And that went on for a few weeks. But when Lily read that out loud to me, I just, that just broke me. It was just so beautiful and so true, of who my daughter is. But it was just arresting to hear that.
I can only imagine. And I think that brings the conversation full circle. I've talked about the generosity. It's an extraordinarily generous book that, again, not only is weaving around this notion of truth and how we find it or define it, but I think the best writers, the best human beings, really grapple with that on a real philosophical level. They're not content to say, "I told it as I feel it." There's a deeper responsibility, I think, to the memory of writers, the memory of those that have survived trauma. But also, I think, and I mentioned this, I think for those that have not yet been able to articulate or share their trauma, and I think maybe the lasting value of this book, because I think it's going to continue to find its audience amongst the more literate set for all the right reasons. But I think a real gift here is that this will be an empowering tool for those that need to find their voice, and they'll be encouraged to do
that. I really hope that's true. I hope so. Yeah, that would be the idea.
Yeah, well, I think mission accomplished, and I genuinely congratulate you and celebrate. I'm deeply humbled to have been able to read the book, and have the opportunity to hear you read from it and talk about it. So I will continue to shout from the rooftops. I think as we get close to our time, I did note at the beginning that according to your bio, you're working on your first novel. How is that going? And how has that been different? And where are we in the process there?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, first of all, I'm not doing much right now because, between work and events and this book and promoting, but it's there, and I'm going to be engaging with it. I actually went into grad school working on the novel that I abandoned for this project because I was writing this work, like what I think of now as on the side, of the novel. And then it just started to take on a life of its own. In particular, after I worked with Dorothy Allison at Tin House, it came to life. And that idea that when the art is its time, you have to go with it. It might, and especially because this is a story that I had tried to tell for so long, and the fact that it was kind of starting to tell itself, it was like, okay, I have to just show up for this. I have to give this my full attention. But the novel that I was working on, and that I want to return to, was set in I was a Waldorf teacher for a long time. And so I'm really, and because my narrator, like, I'm really interested in the kind of the friction between hyper idealism, like when you're really idealistic. And I feel like this is because this is something I struggle with in myself. Um, and what happens when those ideals, are impossible to meet. And so I think this is an issue that a lot of very idealistic communities face. We see it all the time in various religious and church communities. Kind of what are the consequences of these very high ideals when flawed human beings are trying to implement them. So I'm working on a story. The story is kind of explores what happens in the aftermath of a kind of a failure of ideals. And so yeah, so that's what it is. And I'm actually really excited to get back to it, because at first I thought, after the pandemic and after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of the tragedies that we've faced in Trumpism and post-Trumpism and all of that, I thought, do I care about this story anymore? It had been sitting, and I thought, do I care? But as I returned to it, I started to see some unexplored depths, that actually hadn't really been obvious to me before. And that got exciting. I thought, oh, right. Okay. That's where I could go with this. That's where it gets really interesting. So then it came back to life. Yeah.
Good, good. Well, far be it from me to take steal any thunder. We should be focused and celebrating this remarkable achievement. Again, for those of you that joined us tonight, thank you for checking in. The Part That Burns, and I will put this on when I do our write-up on this and share the video. But Jeannine, how can people find you online that are going to want to check you out after listening to you?
Well, I have a website, JeannineOuellette.com. You have to know how to spell Jeannine Ouellette. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And yeah.
Well, listen, I'm fond of saying this to the people who rock our world at 1455. We certainly will follow your trajectory, but we hope that this will not be the last time that we're in conversation. And we'd be delighted to talk to you anytime about craft, and some of the other work you do, which we didn't even have a chance to dive into tonight. So please consider that an open invitation. But for now, much gratitude for writing this book, for your bravery and your brilliance. I hope more people discover this and that this really takes on the life that it deserves.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. It's been really wonderful. It's been just a joy to talk to you. And I'm sure. I hope our paths will cross again.
For sure. All right. Well, be well. Thank you for joining us. Good luck with everything. And we will be in touch soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, Jeannine, take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.